You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up, from wildfires to flooding, voters go to the polls in Australia with climate change high on their agenda. The worst drought in decades sees the number of people in East Africa facing a hunger crisis double in a year. And on a royal visit to Canada, Prince Charles calls for an urgent move to a green economy after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes, and report on the race for solutions. Now, this weekend, Australians will go to the polls after several major weather events in recent weeks. Severe flooding in parts of the country has damaged crops and destroyed lives this year, and consumers have been warned to expect food price rises. While just 2 years ago, huge wildfires ravaged large parts of the countryside and the wildlife population. All this has put climate action high on the agenda for the Australian public. But with an incumbent Prime Minister reluctant to act, smaller, climate-focused parties have seen their popularity rise. Adele Robinson reports.
Sitting on the frontier of a climate crisis, Australia. Towns swallowed by floods, bushfires scorching the earth. And with an election looming, voters' desire for action has a new sense of urgency.
Climate change never used to be considered as a kitchen table issue, as a sort of run-of-the-mill everyday issue. But when your kitchen table's now washing down the street, you realise it is a kitchen table issue. So the hyper concern, I think, is because there are a lot of people in a lot of the country who are feeling quite scared.
But recent analysis of social media coverage shows little to no focus on climate by the main politicians, opposition leader Anthony Albanese or Prime Minister Scott Morrison. The bits in yellow show the number of tweets that actually mention it.
Make no mistake, climate change is here now.
Any policies brought up have been described as scant on detail.
The major political parties have been really trying to downplay climate as an issue, trying not to mention it too much. When they're asked about it, they sort of recite these very uncontroversial rote lines about it. They're not really introducing major new policies.
We'll keep on mining. Of course we'll keep on mining.
And that's partly why. Australia is a major coal exporter. The economy's a priority, but it means independent climate campaigners may tip the balance of power.
You have our Pacific neighbours that have been the voice of reason on climate action and have been calling on Australia to increase its targets and to stop expanding fossil fuel production. And now it's facing this challenge at home, domestically, from these independents that have climate as a front and centre priority and is challenging them in their heartland seats in Sydney and Melbourne.
Recent floods form the election backdrop that's now widely seen as a rapidly disappearing window for meaningful action. Adele Robinson, Sky News.
Let's get some of the day's other climate news now. And a new super nature reserve is being created across 15,000 acres of the Somerset landscape to protect salt marsh, heath and wetland habitats. Natural England has announced a new Somerset Wetlands National Nature Reserve in an area home to rare and threatened species. The move brings together 6 reserves and is going to be the second largest area of lowland peat in the UK. 8 wildcat kittens have been born at the Highland Wildlife Park in Scotland and are likely to be amongst the first to be released into the wild, saving the species from extinction in Britain. The project, led by the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, plans to release the adorable kittens in carefully selected locations in the Cairngorms National Park next year. Jamaican singer and rapper Sean Paul has told Sky News that he's seen the effects of climate change firsthand and is trying to do more to stop coastal erosion in Jamaica. In an interview with Sky's Beth Rigby, the musician said he was speaking to experts on how Jamaica could restore the country's coral reefs, which have been affected by climate change.
Very sad to say right now that there's no more beach. And it's shocking when I remember it as a kid. And so I'm seeing it firsthand. There's no more beach. It's now, the water is now where the shacks are. I've seen work in Dubai or places, even in the States, in Manhattan, where they're putting things in the water so that coral can grow back on it. And I've inquired into that. People that scuba dive tell me that, you know, it's really about the temperature. Yeah. So it's a lot about that. So I'm trying to find some ways that we could do that to help the coastline to be retained.
And you can see that full interview on Beth Rigby Interviews in around 20 minutes' time. And Beth will also be speaking to the US Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, and the President of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou MacDonald. That's on Beth Rigby Interviews tonight at 9 p.m. here on Sky News, and catch up every Friday on Sky Showcase. Now, the worst drought in decades, which is causing a hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa, is reaching catastrophic levels, according to the UN and other humanitarian charities. A report by Save the Children and Oxfam warned that one person is likely to be dying every 48 seconds in the drought-ravaged region of East Africa. The extreme weather, coupled with rising global wheat prices and food shortages, has left livestock dead and forced people from their homes. Well, this drought is affecting millions of lives across the Horn of Africa. The report says nearly 500,000 people across Somalia and parts of Ethiopia are facing famine. In Kenya, 3.5 million people are suffering crisis levels of hunger. And the number of people across the region suffering extreme hunger has risen from 10 million in 2021 to 23 million today. And while the war in Ukraine and global food price rises are contributing to this crisis, climate change causing extreme weather conditions was already having a devastating impact. With industrial nations struggling to reduce their carbon emissions enough to limit global warming, desperate communities are left looking for ways to adapt to their changing environments. Well, let's get more on this. Joining me now from Rome is the Associate Vice President of Programme Management at the UN's International Fund for Agricultural Development, Donal Brown. Donal Brown, thanks so much for talking to us. To begin with, to what extent is climate change responsible for this hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa?
Good evening. It's at the heart of the crisis in the Horn of Africa, and it's compounded by, as you said in your piece, the war in Ukraine and the impact that's having, but also the impact of COVID. People in the Horn of Africa are facing 3 concurrent shocks. But climate change clearly is the long-term most important, and what we have to do is adapt. But as you say, there's about 25 million people in the Horn currently affected, and the situation will get worse.
And what's the main problem that it's causing?
Well, the main problem is the crops are dying in the field. People are not able to plant, and if they do plant, the crops are withering, and as you say, livestock is also being sold because there's not enough water or fodder for them, and this, as I say, is made worse because we do have many farmers. We were talking to one in Somalia last week that does have irrigation systems to be able to water her crops. But with the war in Ukraine and the increase in fuel prices, she can no longer afford the petrol needed to fuel the pumps for the irrigation. So even though she has a solution, she can't use it because she can't afford it.
So what can be done about it, especially given the fact that climate change is at the moment set to get worse? Are there agricultural methods that can be adopted that might be able to help mitigate some of the worst effects?
There's a lot that can be done about it. We have the technologies, we have the solutions here. It's all based around adaptation to climate change. The big problem is investment or lack of it. About 1.7% of global finance for climate is going to adaptation and small farmers who are the most affected. But as you say, and I was in Kenya last week talking to some of the farmers, we need to move away from growing very, very difficult crops like maize that are very prone to drought, and move to things like indigenous crops like sorghum. So we have lots of drought-resistant crops, and we need to move people to growing them. We need to invest in irrigation systems that will conserve water and provide crops to the very, very changing rainfall patterns out there. So there's many, many ways we can do, and we need to invest in early warning systems because if rain comes, comes. Farmers need to know when it comes so they can plant in advance, and weather information systems are very, very rudimentary in this part of Africa. So there's many things we can do if the investment's there. Currently, the investment is not there, and we have to really get it there. Otherwise, it will become a problem for everyone, because if people cannot make livelihoods in these regions, they will move to other ones.
Donald Brown, thanks very much indeed for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, Prince Charles has used his royal visit to Canada as a chance to raise efforts to tackle climate change through green initiatives. Alongside the Canadian Prime Minister, he took part in a roundtable discussion on sustainable finance, where he said the war in Ukraine had hastened the need to move quickly to a green economy. Sky's Rhiannon Mills has more.
There is no doubt that the Prince of Wales wanted to use the profile of this royal tour to once again hammer home the message about the climate crisis and try and encourage as many people from the business community to get on board, because ultimately he believes that business holds the key when it comes to making a really dramatic difference. So he convened a meeting of a Sustainable Markets Initiative. You may have heard us talking about that before. Basically, he's using his leadership, his convening power to try and get some of the most powerful people in the business world round the table and properly get them talking about solutions. But what was interesting is that he was saying in front of the likes of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who he did praise, and he has met on a number of occasions before at COP26 at the G7 summit, saying how it's now no longer enough just to tweak the way that we work or the processes in place. What we really need now is ingenuity and innovation. Now, in terms of getting his message across, of course, there is nothing better than actually going out there and seeing the impact of the climate crisis. And that is exactly what he is going to be doing later on today. We're flying about 4 hours north to the Northern Territories, where he's going to meet the Deta indigenous community, who basically most of the year rely on an ice road, but that has been seriously impacted by warming temperatures. So in the past, that ice road that links the small Deta community to Yellowknife would be operational for about 140 days, but in recent years, it's dropped to only 90 days. And I think for the Prince of Wales, he just really wants to emphasise that actually it's often the poorest, most isolated communities in the world that are really having to deal with the catastrophic impact of the climate crisis.
Do stay with us. Coming up, I'll be joined by Dame Julia King, a member of the Climate Change Committee, and John Verdiek, Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy. And we're going to be talking about the power of people to influence politicians as Australia's prepared to vote. Plus, we'll talk more about what can be done to help alleviate the hunger crisis in Eastern Africa.
We're trying to do something different with this show. We interview interesting people from all walks of life. So you can hear that now.
Yeah, I hear it now.
But we're trying to interview them in a way that it's a conversation.
They jumped out and said, "Are you Mr. Shuri?" And I said, "Yes."
Then we want to try and understand what motivates them.
It's very important that nobody should say that we're trying to avoid scrutiny.
Thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you. I'm there to ask questions that people want answered.
I'm Stuart Ramsey and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. Well, there's a real sense now that people are beginning to expect that this whole airlift is coming to an end, and they're really, really desperate. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people and putting them into trucks.
You either live and recover, or you die.
Okay, so that's like a war.
That's the war, yes.
We help you understand the world with us. Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change. We've been crushed. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world.
They were convinced the United States would become hooked. Well, they were right.
An enormous explosion has just come down. I think it was a monster's just landed in between us. The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world. It's not out of control, but the withdrawn. It's so hot.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now, we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with Climate Change Committee member Dame Julia King and John Verdiek, a director at the Nature Conservancy. So good evening to both of you. Good to see you. So let's talk a bit more about global food security after the warning from the UN Secretary-General this week that global hunger levels are at a new high and that the number of people facing severe food insecurity is doubling in the last 2 years to reach 276 million today. So, John, how much of a crisis would you say we're witnessing when it comes to access to food around the world? And to what extent is climate change having an impact on that crisis?
Climate change has always been a threat multiplier in a way, and we're seeing in Eastern Africa, this is an area that's always been vulnerable to different changes in weather and drought, and now we're seeing climate change exacerbate that. And I don't think we really know exactly how far this is going to go and what other changes are going to make, but we are seeing, this was already starting to happen before the invasion. Now we're starting to see Ukrainian and Russian exports change. We're seeing other countries that are big importers. They're going to have to change some of their policies as well. One of the worries that we would have is to see if we're going to have more countries that are actually going to come out and have export bans. That would change the global trade system and could have even further consequences.
Well, yes, and Julia, as John was hinting there, the war in Ukraine is having a massive impact on food security as well, isn't it? And is it the case that if the West is being affected by shortages of food, they're more likely to see the whole issue of food security more clearly, and there's some hope that action might be taken across the world?
I think you're right. I mean, I think COVID and empty supermarket shelves in the UK and now the war in Ukraine, I think they are reminding us all that the security of our supply chains is at risk, and it's very much at risk from climate change, of course. And it's something that we on the Climate Change Committee flagged up to the UK government, in a UK context, that we need to be focusing more on our supply chains and their sensitivity to climate change, our overseas supply chains. But it feels terrible to be worrying about, us in the UK when you hear what's going on in Kenya and Ethiopia at the moment.
Well, that's right. And John, that's really a priority, isn't it, when people are dying of hunger? So what action can be taken? I mean, obviously tackling emissions when it comes to climate change, the hope is that will have a longer term effect, but there's real need now.
Absolutely. There's a real need for food. There's a real need for, we heard earlier, adaptation is going to be a significant piece there. We need to build more resilient food systems in many parts of the world. We just saw the other day, too, I think we just saw the G7 come out and say that there's going to be a new global alliance for food security. One of the nice pieces that comes out of this sort of thinking is not only is there money going now to help provide food around the world, but there's also thinking of making sure that we're not just producing more, but that we're building a more resilient system that can absorb some of these shocks better in the future.
And Julie, we heard from our UN guest a bit earlier saying there are methods of adaptation available there that can make a difference, but funding is a real problem. I mean, where will that money come from to help people in poorer countries?
You're absolutely right, funding is a problem. And that was one of the things I think that came across very strongly at at COP26 was adaptation is really the poor relation compared to mitigation in terms of funding. We need to develop better investment propositions for adaptation, but we also need to see the developed countries putting more money into supporting adaptation, particularly in the global south.
John, do you agree it's richer countries need to step up?
Absolutely. I mean, we're 6 months out from COP26 in Glasgow this last year, and we're 6 months from the Egyptian COP this coming year. We saw lots of pledges from public and private sector interests looking forward to what we can do on climate. Now is kind of one of those times that we need to make sure that these investments are hitting the ground, that we're implementing these projects for the people that are on the ground. Global food security is also a huge trouble when we look at ramifications that could eventually come out. We think about a decade ago, we had the Arab Spring. Many of those issues were brought about from food insecurity and inflated prices. How do we make sure that as we go to COP27 in Egypt next year in Sharm el-Sheikh, that we are doing exactly what we pledged we would do last year?
Julia, very briefly, though, is that a tough ask when there are countries struggling with the cost of living crisis around the world? And the UK, obviously, it's been across our news daily.
I don't think it is a tough ask. The rich world, and we are part of the rich world, needs to do something about this. And we also have our own problems of distribution, but we don't actually have a problem that we haven't overall got enough money in the UK to help in situations like this.
OK, let's move on to our next topic. And from destructive wildfires in 2020 to extreme levels of flooding a few weeks ago, Australia is becoming increasingly aware of the effects of extreme weather. And while there's widespread public support for climate change action, it's something missing from the discussion in the build-up to this weekend's general election. So why is there a mismatch between public opinion and politicians' perspective? And is this affecting campaigners' ability to shift the dial at all? Julia, some polls show that climate change is the #1 issue for Australian voters. Does it surprise you, then, that it's barely mentioned by the politicians?
It seems really shocking to me. But I suppose for the Labour Party in Australia, the sort of shadow of Julia Gillard's problem with her climate tax that became so deeply unpopular and is accredited with leading to wherever it is they've had 13 years of the more conservative government. I think that kind of hangs over the politicians there, and they're very worried about pushing too hard on it, which is very unfortunate.
John, do you think this tells us anything more broadly about the power of public opinion in driving policy when it comes to climate change?
Yes, I think public opinion can kind of go in two ways, especially with politics, and that politicians tend to listen to the people that elect them, but they also need to be putting forward some pressure as well too. And what we're going to see, from some groups, think about Australia, it's a little bit similar to the dynamic that's happening in the United States, where you do have different political parties with different views. We are going to have electoral cycles where we're going to have more climate ambition or less climate ambition. One of the things that we need to do is make sure that not just at the federal level or at the national level, but at all the different local levels we possibly can, to be pushing climate action, to be pushing environmental action, and dealing with these elements as much as we can everywhere.
And you're in the House of Lords, Julia, so you're in a unique position to kind of assess what a driver of policy change is. What role do you think that public opinion plays?
Well, I think because Australia, voting is compulsory in Australia, I think the public there are actually even more powerful, because politicians have to recognise that every one of them, well, almost every one of them will actually vote. So I think that actually sort of adds to the sort of pressure the public is able to put on. But I think we do see public opinion providing pressure in the UK. I think it's what's actually kept the fact that we still have pretty much cross-party agreement on delivering the Climate Change Act in the UK. And I think that's hugely important.
What about other pressures, John? I mean, what about global pressure, international pressure, summits like COP, where countries can be named and shamed and look like they're standing out on their own? Is that really what matters to the politicians in charge at any one time?
I think most politicians, their first thing that they listen to is the domestic electorate. But beyond that, there is international pressure as well. Just before COP26, it was looking like Australia was not going to come forward with a new climate pledge, a new nationally determined contribution. But I think we saw some international pressure coming forward, and many other countries coming forward with their new NDCs. And then Australia did put a new NDC out. Now, they didn't change the number in it. They didn't change the kind of ambition of their pledge, but they did add additional information saying how they were going to do it and in what ways. This is the kind of thing that, transparency publicly and internationally around climate change is one of the most powerful tools we actually have.
And I saw you nodding there, Dame Julia. Did you want to add anything?
No, I was just agreeing. I think they're very good points.
Well, on that note of agreement, we will leave it there then. Thank you both very much indeed for your time. Really interesting to get your take on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do stay with us. Coming up next on Sky News, Beth Rigby interviews guests including the US Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, the President of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald, and the rapper Sean Paul. So do stay tuned for that. But that's it from me. Thank you for watching.